I'd like to begin with a warm-up. I want you to take these 4 simple sentences and combine them into a single complex sentence. The independent clause should have a compound or combined predicate. Let's break this up a bit. First of all, if you're going to have a complex sentence, you need to have a dependent clause, and it should begin with one of these conjunctions. I think this has an effect and a cause. Think about which one goes with that. Now, let's make it a little easier. Do you notice a pattern? Take a look at those first 2 sentences. Do you see it? There's a prepositional phrase. You can combine these sentences by simply moving that phrase. That should make it simpler. What about the independent clause, the one that could stand on its own? How is it going to be a compound or combined predicate? Well, take a look for yourself. Do you see it? Those last 2 sentences, they have the same subject. All we have to do is combine them, use the same subject but with 2 different verbs. That would make that a compound simple sentence, a compound predicate simple sentence. I'll give you about 3 minutes here. If you need a little more time, you're welcome to pause the video. Good luck. Well, how'd you do, historians? This is what I came up with. Civil rights leaders started a boycott of the segregated bus system because they were tired of being treated unfairly and wanted to spread integration outside of schools. fight for civil rights and integration was starting to gain a lot of momentum in the 1950s. Look at the great achievements that were behind the civil rights movement at this time. The Brown v. Board decision and the powerful, peaceful Montgomery bus boycott. The 1954 Brown v. Board decision was momentous. It meant that the federal courts, the national courts, were willing to stand up for civil rights and to force integration. By the way, do you remember Thurgood Marshall? He was the lawyer for the Brown family. He stood for integration in schools. He would go on to become the first black justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Quite an achievement. Something else to consider. All 9 justices, all 9 judges of the U.S. Supreme Court agreed that integration needed to begin. This was an incredible victory for civil rights. But it came with a catch. The courts had only ordered that integration should begin in schools. Other places like hospitals and buses were not affected by the Brown decision. The fight for integration would have to leave the classroom. People like Rosa Parks and Dr. King would continue the fight in desegregating or bringing integration to places like buses. Rosa Parks openly defied the segregation laws of Montgomery, Alabama. She went to jail. In the year that followed, the 381 days that followed her release from jail, the nation watched as Montgomery was involved in a new and powerful kind of protest. Do you remember what it was called? It was called a boycott. This was a peaceful way of expressing your disapproval of a business or government or other service. For 381 days, the black community of Montgomery refused to use the bus. This was their way of saying they did not approve of segregation. It was unfair and it needed to end. It was their way of standing behind Rosa Parks, who had been arrested and jailed because of a ridiculous law. How could this possibly be successful? Well, it brought the bus companies to its knees, so the saying goes. It turns out that the African American community was the number one client of the buses in Montgomery. Those 30 to 40,000 tickets a day, well, those were not finding their way into the hands of the bus company, which nearly went bankrupt. Eventually, leaders in the business community gave way. The boycott ended only after the Supreme Court, who had caught wind of all this, had finally ordered the companies to integrate the buses. But it came at a cost. Rosa Parks and others lost their jobs, were arrested, even attacked. And the fight wasn't nearly over. As for schools, many states and individuals still refused to follow the court's orders. They illegally stood in the way of school integration. And in both cases, the hound dog of segregation was starting to bare its teeth. Today we're going to go back to the classroom. We're going to go back to school. And we're going to see how the hound dog was especially nasty following the Brown v. Board decision. You already saw a taste of it in the story of Ruby Bridges. To understand how it could be especially nasty, we have to take a trip to Arkansas. Crisis in Little Rock. The year is 1957. Just a few years prior, or earlier, the Supreme Court had ordered schools to begin integrating. But the hound dog of segregation was a stubborn creature. That was the easy part, just getting the orders from the court. The hard part would actually be convincing people to stop standing in the way. In 1957, a federal court ordered Little Rock, Arkansas to desegregate their schools. Think of what that means, to integrate them. 9 brave African-American students registered at Little Rock Central High School. They were supposed to start on September 4th, but the Arkansas governor sent armed guards to keep them out. Let's think about what this means. Imagine how you might feel if you were confronted by men with guns and helmets blocking your entrance to school. This was a powerful gesture. This was a powerful message. It was a hateful one that was saying, "You are not welcome." President Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the U.S., got involved. He told the governor not to interfere. "Stand down," he said. On September 23rd, the Little Rock Nine were escorted into the school. That means they were accompanied by armed guards to keep them safe. However, angry parents and students caused problems outside the school, so the students were taken out of the school for their own safety. This was the hound dog acting up again. The next day, U.S. troops arrived, sent by the president himself. On the 25th, the Army troops led students into the school. The students faced name-calling, beatings, and threats on a daily basis. It was a high price to pay for an equal education. Does this sound familiar to you? Angry mobs shouting and threatening? Well, you've already seen it in the story of Ruby Bridges. And just consider that this was 3 years after the Little Rock Nine crisis, showing you just how slow integration could be. Let's review what happened there. In 1960, New Orleans was ordered to desegregate its schools, much as Arkansas schools had been ordered 3 years earlier. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who was born the year of the Brown decision, started first grade at an all-white school. To show their anger, the white parents pulled their children out of Ruby's first grade class. For an entire year, Ruby was in a class all by herself. She had an amazing teacher named Barbara Henry. For most of the year, protesters stood outside the school. It was a very difficult year for the Bridges family. What do these two have in common? Both of them show states and individuals standing in the way of integration. Let's review what had happened. What exactly was this Little Rock crisis of 1957? Remember, when we say crisis, we mean a great problem. What was this problem? Well, I think the details can be summarized quite quickly and easily. Schools needed to desegregate. They needed to integrate. It was the ruling of the court. The Little Rock Nine students were the first students in Little Rock, Arkansas, to start that process going. They couldn't get to school. The governor had ordered troops to stand guard to prevent them from entering. The only way that they could enter safely is if the President of the United States got involved. That's precisely what happened. The remarkable thing is that this played out on national television. More about that in a few moments. But let's look at that other issue. The President himself got involved. To people in 1957, this was an enormous change. This was a huge deal. There's a deep issue underlying this, besides the issue of fairness and equality. What is the idea of states' rights? Do you remember that? We talked about it when we discussed the Civil War. It was an idea that was very popular to many Southern leaders before the Civil War began. It's the idea that states should have more control over their laws than the federal government, the national government. In other words, states ought to be able to make their own decisions about laws that affect them locally, and the federal or national government, here represented by the president, should have only a little to say. This is exactly what the governor of Arkansas, you'll meet him shortly, Governor Orval Faubus, this is what he thought. Little Rock had a right to make its own laws, and those laws favored segregation. How did this crisis of 1957, this great problem, create a conflict between the two kinds of government in our country, the state government on one hand or the federal government on the other? Remember, federal means national. Well, this was a conflict. This was the state being told by the federal government that it had to obey the laws, and it was breaking the laws. And this was the state government, represented by Governor Faubus, standing in the way of a federal order. This was a direct conflict between these two kinds of government. Drama in Little Rock. Let's look at the characters involved here. let's try to get a better understanding of what was going on in the minds of people in 1957. In this famous photograph, Elizabeth Eckford sets off for school amid a crowd of screaming protesters. She was one of the Little Rock Nine, one of the brave students who tried to integrate Little Rock Central High School. What were these protesters protesting? What were they screaming about? Well, on the one hand, they were protesting integration. They were defying or standing in the way of desegregation. But let's be honest, in a way they were protesting something else, someone else. They were protesting 9 other human beings. This was a very hateful message. Eckford was 15 years old at the time. She later recalled, "It was the longest block I ever walked in my whole life." We can see in this primary source in the photograph from the time just what she would have had to have endured. Just on the walk there, she would have had to get past all of these angry white folks. Look at the twisted expression on the face of the woman behind Elizabeth. It's hard to imagine being so passionate about something so misguided, having such strong feelings against something as wonderful as integration. And yet this is what faced Elizabeth. Now imagine what faced her when she finally reached the school, having crossed the paths of all of these angry protesters, men with guns that could be aimed at her. Those men were there to stop her from entering. I can't imagine a gesture, a message more unwelcoming than this. I think it's quite marvelous that Elizabeth Eckford and the other 8 students managed to endure this terrible insult, the threats, and even the violence. Let's meet our next character. This is the governor of Arkansas, Governor Orval Faubus. Here he's featured on the cover of one of the country's most famous magazines. He was famous around the whole country because of this episode, this crisis. Actually, he would become famous around the whole world. On September 4th, Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus ordered the state's National Guard to prevent or stop 9 black students from enrolling or entering at Little Rock's all-white Central High School. Little Rock had been chosen by civil rights leaders for a test case because they thought it was a somewhat open-minded city. Let's unpack some of this. Here's something that I find confusing. The National Guard has a very confusing name to me. Actually, every state has its own National Guard. That's a little confusing because the word national refers to the entire nation. Just remember that the state of Arkansas had its own special troops, called the National Guard, and they were under the control of its governor, Governor Orval Faubus. What did he try to do with the Guard, with the troops that were under his command? He tried to prevent the black students from entering the school. He tried to stop them from enrolling. Why Little Rock? Civil rights leaders and the Little Rock Nine themselves had chosen this place because, well, compared to many other places in Arkansas and other states in the South, Little Rock was fairly open-minded. At least that's what it looked like, and it probably was in the end. It's tempting to say that the angry protesters, those ridiculous people that we see in those images, didn't speak for everybody there. I don't know the answer to that. In any case, civil rights leaders did choose this city because they thought they could make some progress here. However, Faubus's order turned that test of integration in an open-minded city, his orders turned that test into a kind of television circus. Large mobs of angry whites appeared each morning to make sure that the Guard turned the black students away. What do we mean by a television circus? I'm sure you figure that I don't mean people walking on stilts, clowns, and elephants. No, not that, of course. But think about what you know about a circus, even if you've never been to one. I haven't been to one myself, but I've seen them in cartoons and in movies. They're noisy and raucous, and there are people moving around. And, of course, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a spectacle. Governor Faubus knew that there was a new technology around. the television, something we haven't discussed much. And he was very good, he was very clever, savvy is the word. He was very savvy at performing in front of the television audience. And he knew how to work a crowd, as they say. He indeed wanted to stop Little Rock from being integrated, from being desegregated. And the trick that he used was a noisy spectacle, a spectacle of anger. But he also used another tool that only a governor could use. He used the troops at his disposal, the troops under his command, to physically stop those students from entering. Then enters our last character. Perhaps you recognize him. This is President Dwight Eisenhower. He personally called Governor Faubus on the telephone and asked him not to defy or go against the Supreme Court by stopping integration. And when that failed, when Governor Faubus refused to listen, the president responded to Faubus's actions by issuing or giving the most powerful thing he could, the presidential order. It was an order for the Arkansas National Guard to stand down. He ordered the troops under the control of the governor to stop it, to move aside. Eisenhower then went a step further. He sent federal or national soldiers to help the 9 students enter the school. That wasn't it. Later, Eisenhower used his power yet again, this time, as president, to take the Arkansas National Guard out of the control of Governor Faubus and place them under his own control. He was removing one of the most powerful tools of the governor. He was taking away the governor's own control. This was an extraordinarily powerful gesture. We're going to watch a video about this. You're going to see news footage from the time. This is a video from an award that was given to the Little Rock Nine by Marquette University some years after the events that you'll see. We call this newsreel. That means these were real events that were captured, sometimes live, and they were broadcast or sent all around the country. Now, I want you to consider something. Let's go back to Eisenhower for a moment. This was playing out in front of the entire country. People were alarmed when they saw this. Here, their own president was standing up for the federal government and defying one of the state's leaders. Does that sound familiar? In many ways, people thought that this was going to be a second Battle of Fort Sumter. Remember that? That was that first battle of the Civil War. What do I mean by that? Many people were afraid that the United States was hurtling towards a second Civil War because the same issues were now surfacing again. Not slavery, of course, but the issue of the federal or national government and how much power it should have over states to make their own laws. Although the laws here weren't about slavery, they were about discrimination and harming the African American community within those states. People saw this play out on television, fairly new technology, and it was quite shocking. Some people who had never considered segregation or integration learned about it for the first time in this manner, or it was thrust in front of them dramatically as they watched from the television sets. This was powerful imagery, and I'd like you to see some of it. I want you to pay attention in particular to a few things. Early on in the video, you're going to see a white man give some arguments about why he thinks segregation should stand and why the Little Rock students shouldn't enter. Listen very carefully to his reasons. You don't need me to tell you, they aren't very good reasons. We'll talk about them in a moment. I also want you to pay close attention to the way that the protesters are behaving. The white people who were protesting the integration of Little Rock Central High were very unlike the protesters that we saw in Montgomery. Think about what those protesters were doing. Well, nothing. It was peaceful. They were simply choosing not to participate in a service. The people here, you'll see, not only were standing in the way of integration and defying the court, they were doing it in a ridiculous way. One of your literacy words that comes to mind is absurd. A third thing I want you to pay attention to. I want you to look at the Little Rock 9 students themselves. In particular, You're going to hear one of them answer a question from a reporter, a journalist. Her words are important, but I also want you to pay close attention to how she reacts, to her face. It's quite interesting. Here's a video from 1957, with images from 1957. We'll come back in a few moments after the video to discuss what happened.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school with them.
But some of the most difficult lessons we learn are a result of individuals who push us through these divisive barriers. In September of 1957, 9 black school children, the eldest only 17, forced us through such a blockade. They sought a better education for themselves and the opportunity to pursue the American dream.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school, under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now. And their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
We were Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, Thelma Mothershed, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Carlotta Walls, Melba Patillo, Minnie Jean Brown, and Gloria Ray.
They became known as the Little Rock Nine. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education found segregation of schools unconstitutional. But as the Little Rock Nine approached the high school, segregationists swarmed the campus.
They got no business out here. This is our school, not theirs. They have their own.
As the violence escalated, one schoolgirl, Elizabeth Eckford, was threatened by an angry mob chanting, "Lynch her, lynch her." President Dwight Eisenhower intervened in Little Rock and set a precedent for our nation as a whole.
Such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law, solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court.
On September 25, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs and made their way to the classrooms of Little Rock Central High School.
Just got a report here on this end that the students are in.
You feel it's worth it going through this?
Yes, I do.
These 9 heroes were willing to step forward and in doing so altered the course of history. Marquette University is honored to bestow upon them the Pierre Marquette Discovery Award for this extraordinary contribution to the advancement of education for all people. The Little Rock Nine stand not just for racial equality, but also for the promise upon which our society is founded: opportunity and equality for all willing to strive, struggle, and achieve.
Those images are quite powerful to me. Let's look at what you saw. Early on in the video, you saw a man give his reasons why the 9 students shouldn't be able to go to school. Think about what he said. He said, they have their schools and we have our schools. Let the black people go to the black schools and the white people go to the white schools. What right do they have? He later adds. This is the kind of thing that a supporter of segregation took seriously. This was an argument that this man and others like him, possibly even Governor Faubus, thought could be said in all seriousness. To us, it's absurd. What rights did Elizabeth Eckford and other students have to go to that school? Well, they had every right in the world. And not only is it a simple matter of human decency, just being kind to one another, the courts had already ordered. They had every right to be there. It's interesting to see that this man thinks that these arguments are persuasive to him, that they convince him. What did you notice about the protesters? Do you see how unruly they are? Do you see how, frankly, ridiculous they appear sometimes, as they even attack the other police officers who were trying to stop them, and tear down barricades and other things in the way, shouting at the students? But they're not just ridiculous, the word I used a moment ago. How deeply threatening they were. I, for one, would have been terrified to be confronted with such a crowd of such misguided people. People who were consumed by such a misguided feeling, such terrible hatred. It was hatred not only about integration, this was hatred at the students there themselves. It's hard for me to look at this. It's like looking at an alien planet. In any case, I can't imagine a more unwelcoming gesture. And to think that Eckford and other students would have to have passed those angry mobs only to see the governor's troops standing in front of them with guns. Nothing more threatening, in my mind. And yet, did you notice how that young student responded or answered to the question that was given to her by a journalist, a reporter? He said, "Is it worth it?" Of course it is. Her answer is not surprising. We've already seen how much courage civil rights leaders, including these young students, had. And that was quite remarkable, given how vicious the hound dog of segregation was becoming. But did you notice how she said it? She was graceful. She even smiled. What are we to make of Governor Faubus? He's a very interesting figure, a very interesting person. I would like very much to interview him. He's no longer living, but I'd like to know, when he's no longer a governor, what was running through his mind. There are some things that I think are quite clear. Let's talk first about his motives. Do you remember that word? Motivations? Motives? We talked about it in our exploration unit. It means the reasons why we do things. I think his motives were racist. He was against integration. But there's something else very interesting about him. He was the governor of a state, and he would have known that there were people who supported segregation, who didn't want the Little Rock 9 students to go to that school. He knew that there were such people that felt that way, but didn't show up to protest. Of course, there were millions of others of people who probably felt the same way as the people there, and yet didn't protest. I'll bet they didn't think that any harm should have come to those students. Governor Faubus did very interesting things in front of the camera. He didn't say anything very insulting about the students. He was very slick. He would have said things like he was protecting the Little Rock 9 to keep them where they would be safe in their own communities. That segregation had worked for the people of Arkansas for a long time, and he wanted to see the students thrive in their own communities, of course. We shouldn't be tempted by this. We shouldn't be persuaded by this for a moment. These arguments are, well, there's that word again, absurd. They don't make sense. We shouldn't believe them. This was segregation, pure and simple. There's no reason for it. Governor Faubus was very clever at, 1, creating a spectacle for the cameras, and 2, well, speaking in a very slick way that didn't make him look particularly villainous to people who hadn't made their minds up about segregation. In the end, of course, he would fail. Segregation would end in Arkansas, and Governor Faubus is now someone that we look on, well, we have to be very careful the way we think about him. It's difficult to say anything. It's difficult to find much kindness to speak about him today. But there's another thing that I want you to consider. This was a very dramatic moment. The nation watched as Governor Faubus created his public spectacle to the humiliation of these students, and they watched as the troops under the control of the president marched into Little Rock in order to keep those students safe. This looked to many people as though this could be the start of a civil war. It showed, though, that the president was willing to do what it took in order to fight for integration, even if it meant at least creating the message that there was a terrible conflict between the federal and state governments. Something interesting about Eisenhower, he had very mixed feelings about the Brown versus Board decision. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Yet, he was a person who honored the law, and as president, he represented the law and did what it took to make sure that the law was followed. Do you recognize that music? You've been hearing it at the beginning of these lessons over the last few weeks. This is Charles Mingus, a great jazz composer and bassist. He's actually my favorite jazz composer and musician. You may be wondering why the lessons have begun with this particular melody. It's a pretty cool tune. You ready for it? Here's the title. Fables of Faubus, 1959, just 2 years after the Little Rock crisis. Yep, it's the Faubus, the governor. Charles Mingus was creating, without any words, a song that was his own kind of protest against the governor. Think about what he means. Fables, of course, those are stories that have a moral, like the fables of Aesop. Well, the governor had his own morals, didn't he? He had his own lesson that he wanted to teach. It was a hateful one that involved segregation. I like to think that Charles Mingus had in mind a kind of clumsy, villainous character lurching across the screen of an old movie. We know that Governor Faubus was quite a slick politician, but it's nice to think that his worst decisions, his misguided choices as a leader, were made fun of in a very interesting and lovely way. Think about that the next time you hear that tune. Let's add this to our timeline of the civil rights movement. Take out the paper that you began last week. We're now ready to add a third event to that second half, right after the Brown Board decision and the Montgomery bus boycott that extended the fight for integration beyond the schools. The year was 1957. Let's add that now. Write it neatly. We still have several more entries to go. Little Rock 9 crisis. Let's also write a note about what this means. What's the significance? The federal government begins to force school integration. It was an event that showed that the president himself was willing to get involved. Tomorrow we'll be adding the event that goes with 1961, so keep this paper safe and sound. It's a useful tool. The event shows something else as well. Remember the hound dog? How could you forget? The hound dog of segregation in 1957 was now starting to show its teeth. Not only was the hound dog becoming so desperate that it was using illegal actions like those of Governor Faubus, but supporters of segregation like Faubus were starting to rile up angry people. Individuals were starting to turn out to threaten and beat the people that stood for integration. We're ready to add to our integration baseball metaphor. Take it out. On the one hand, there's the Jim Crow team, the opposing side. My, they are some ugly ones. The home team, of course, is the civil rights team, here represented by the batter, Jackie Robinson. Here comes the windup and the pitch, and the civil rights team has lobbed it and slides into first base. Take that, de facto segregation. This was the beginning of integration in one small place, but a very public place. Well, keep going, man. You can do it. The next thing is to overcome those nasty, unfair court decisions. Plessy versus Ferguson has got to go. The chimera of Plessy versus Ferguson was defeated. Integration in schools could finally begin. The Brown Brown versus Board of Education had laid down the law. Now our player has his eyes on third base, but guarding it is none other than Medusa herself. Illegal actions by the states, illegal actions like those of Governor Faubus, illegal actions of the angry, misguided protesters who confronted the Little Rock Nine and Ruby Bridges 3 years after that. Take that, Medusa. This was the federal government showing that it could stand up for integration. The only thing left, the only monster guarding home plate, the only one left was the Jim Crow laws themselves. What did this say? What could we infer about the process of integration? Although the Little Rock Nine achieved a great victory for school integration and showed the federal government could help integration, supporters of full integration had only reached, think about it, what's next in our metaphor? Well, supporters of full integration had only reached third base. This tells us integration was a slow process, and it happened one small step at a time. The federal government still had done little or nothing to begin integrating public places outside of schools, such as offices, hospitals, and businesses. It had helped to integrate buses, but that was only one small step. We haven't hit a home run yet. We're not at home plate. But we can add this to our civil rights integration baseball worksheet. I'd like you to take it out if you don't have it out already. While you're looking for it, let's walk through where we've been. The first great achievement was overcoming the custom of segregation, de facto segregation, in baseball. It was one small step, but an important one. Next up, unfair court decisions, here represented by the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Remember the one that talks about separate but equal? That had to go. It had to be overturned. What did it? What defeated it? What finally brought about integration in schools? That was the Brown decision of 1954. Now we're ready to add third base, and that's what we'll do today. Third base here was guarded by Medusa. Illegal actions by the states. That was the next roadblock, the next obstacle. Here, the event that stands for this action, the action against the chimera guarding third base, was the Little Rock Nine crisis. Add that to your map as well. One last piece. What did it mean? In all caps, write it with pride, write it with gusto. This is one of the great achievements of our country's history. The federal government forced school integration. It stood up for civil rights in a most dramatic way. The only thing left is the chimera guarding home plate, the worst villain of them all, the Jim Crow laws. They could be defeated here and there, or parts of them could go away with this or that court decision or this or that protest. But the only thing that would finally be a home run for integration was to have a dagger in the heart of Jim Crow himself, the defeat of the Jim Crow laws, to strike them from our nation's laws forever. That was the goal that civil rights leaders had in mind.